Okay, good morning, everyone. Thinking this will probably be our last actual lecture. I should get through all the material by the end of the class. And then next week we'll do a review and get you ready for the exam. And I will also go through the works list and eliminate some work so you don't have quite so many to study. So anybody have any questions at this point? So we're pretty much coming to the end of the century. We're starting with the date of 1889 here, when the Third Republic in France held a great international exposition in Paris to commemorate the centennial of the French Revolution, so from 1789 to 1889. And the centerpiece of the exposition was this amazing structure. It was basically a gateway to the grounds of the exposition. It was designed by Gustave Eiffel, and we call it the Eiffel Tower. So it was originally part of an international exposition. And interestingly, Gustave Eiffel was not an architect, but rather an engineer, which is kind of indicative of what these expositions were all about, sort of celebrating progress and technology. The tower was a monumental feat of engineering. It's over 300 meters high, which made it the tallest building in the world at the time, 81 stories high. And it was a new type of construction. In a sense, it sort of partakes of the old and the new, because it structurally combines the look of the Roman triumphal arch going back to ancient imperial times and the Gothic spire, which was such a big part of French Gothic churches. So it's kind of rooted in a historical style, but the construction is something very modern. It consists of wrought iron parts that combine supporting girders with open lattice work. And like the Crystal Palace in London, it was manufactured off-site, and it was a series of prefabricated parts. And basically, it consists of these four enormous piers. So on each side of the arch is a pier, and there are four of those. And one of the really great kind of innovative things was that the piers contained elevators. The Otis Elevator Company had come on the scene, and this was an amazing new technology. When the exposition opened, the whole Eiffel Tower was covered in iridescent paint so that it would shimmer during the day, and then in the evening it was lit by gas and electricity, so that it had this effect of being glowing. And then just it was dark for decades after that, and then when the millennium came in Paris, they outfitted it with lights, so now you can see it illuminated at night. It continued to be important into the 20th century when it became an important source for radio transmission. So the exposition was quite an expansive thing. It included, once again, a hall of machines to celebrate progress. But this was a hall like they'd never seen before. It was massive, and it displayed everything from light bulbs invented by Thomas Edison to phonographs, and then once again all of these different machines and so on. There's another view of it, and another view. And you can see it looks very industrial and very progressive. One of the other important exhibitions was the Hall of Habitation, which showcased different houses or housing forms from the past and from around the world. And interestingly, it was set up along the Seine River as a kind of contrast to the modern Hall of Machines. So it presented a kind of foil for progress. And you can see everything from the upper left, the cave structures of the troglodytes, and different types of structures they developed over time. And one of the major features of this hall of habitation were the architectural displays that were the colonial palaces. And so many Western countries, of course, had huge colonial holdings in different regions of the world. And these colonial exhibits were kind of displays of ownership and power over these nations and these people. This is the colonial palace from Brazil. This one's from Venezuela. The one in your book is from Tunisia. And inside, they displayed raw materials, imported goods, manufactured items from the colonies, but also a lot of native artifacts, tools, costumes, documentary photographs, and so on. Some of the most chilling exhibitions that were kind of a part of this took place outside of the Hall of Habitation. And these were the colonial villages. Now, since the earliest explorations of the New World and other non-Western regions, explorers had been bringing back people for scientists to study, curiosity seekers to observe. Some of the earliest, Christopher Columbus brought back a couple of Arawak Indians to the court of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. Martin Frobisher brought an Inuit couple and baby back from his expedition. And in 1889, the exposition displayed native villages which were populated by people imported, literally villages imported from Asia and Africa. And there would be like 50 to 200 at a time. And the idea was that the viewers could observe the daily life of the people. And this is a practice that continued well into the 20th century, and not just in France, but at the World Expositions held in Germany and other places. And you can see how this sort of fed things like the rise of the Nazi Party. Here's a poster depicting a village from the Zoological Garden in Paris. Here, a group being transported to the colonial village sites. This is actually from this is from the States, in St. Louis, a World Exposition a few years later, where they had an African village set up, and then you can see it's really quite chilling. On the right, there's like a viewing platform, and so the visitors to the exposition could come and see these people in what was described as their natural habitat.
How did they get those people there?
They shipped them over.
But how did they convince them to come with them?
I don't know if it was a convincing kind of thing. I think it was you're owned by us, so jump on the truck or the train or the boat. Here's another group, and it's an interesting juxtaposition. You see the Europeans in their hats and so on, and then these other people, native people. So the idea was to educate Europeans with regard to these different cultures, and so showing the different food and dress and language and customs. But it's also obviously a celebration and legitimization of colonial enterprises. Because the emphasis was very much on the primitive nature of life and culture. And it was acting, in a sense, as a kind of proof that colonization was good because it brought technology and progress, etc., to these so-called primitive people. Your book talks about a display called Cairo Street, where they actually reconstructed a street in Old Cairo, so using architectural fragments and then bringing in musicians and camels and donkeys to create what was supposed to be an authentic replica of a street in Cairo, Egypt. Only they did things like they created a mosque, which of course is a place of religious worship, and they populated it with dancing girls and transformed it into a coffee house, which was incredibly offensive to Islamic visitors. Another important area for exhibition was the Fine Arts Palace, which was a site for display of many examples of painting and sculpture from a wide variety of European countries. And we've seen this as kind of a standard now in these international expositions. And especially in France, they're celebrating the centennial since the revolution. And so they showcased all of the greats that we've been looking at, the work of David and Delacroix and so on, as a kind of grandiose display of France's artistic achievements. There was also a decennial exhibition, which was art of the last decade, and it coincided with the exhibition at the Salon, where there were over 5,000 entries, so there was a lot of stuff going on in Paris at that moment. Now, interestingly, no French Impressionists were exhibited, no Post-Impressionists. It was only the much more conservative trend of naturalism, capital N. And one of the stars of the French naturalist group was an artist by the name of Pascal Aldorjean Damien Bouveret. And this is his work entitled Brittany Pardon, which was hailed as a masterpiece. And you can see, just from a stylistic point, it's very much naturalistic, based on an academic method. He did a lot of preliminary sketches, but in addition, he also used photography, which was a modern innovation. And in your book, there's a photograph of the woman at the front left, which was the model for the woman in the painting. The subject, however, was much more traditional. Brittany, already in France, was considered an area in the western part of the country that was very isolated, and so therefore very, very traditional, steeped in sort of the ancient customs that had been in play for centuries. And the Brittany Pardon was a kind of ritual that was enacted. It was an act of penitence performed by the Breton people, which consisted of crawling or walking in their bare feet in a procession on the ground to absolve themselves of sins. And so it refers to this idea of French nationalism because it's certainly showcasing the French history and traditions that were such a part of French culture, which were disappearing in the wake of progress. And this is what you tend to see in all of the countries that are represented here. There is a focus on the style of naturalism, but the theme of nationalism, and nationalism as something that's very much steeped in the past. So history and tradition. This is I think is a really interesting work that is by Bastien Lepage, and he, I think, had since died, but this was exhibited anyway. And it's a London bootblack, and your book talks about it as an example of urban naturalism instead of the rural kind of peasant things. But I also think it's interesting because it shows that even these very conservative painters were very aware of the new styles emerging, like Impressionism. It gives that sense of the movement of the city in the back. We've got the cropping, of the horse and carriage, and it really captures in many ways the spirit of the Impressionists, although the tremendous detail it's given to the face of the boy and so on is still naturalist. But these artists are certainly aware of what's going on, and we can see it as a nod in the direction of Impressionism and modernism. Lots of representation by Scandinavian countries, and they were represented. So this is Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and even Finland, which isn't actually Scandinavian, but it's sort of lumped in there. And they were very much establishing themselves as individual countries with individual national identity. And this is by a Norwegian artist by the name of Erik Wernskjold. It depicts a peasant burial, and it is clearly representing the Norwegian landscape. You can see the mountains and so on in the background in a very naturalist kind of fashion. And it's depicting a rural, old-fashioned kind of peasant burial, and it really speaks of the nostalgia of the simple life and the bygone days. And so we have, this is actually a teacher who stands in place of a pastor. We have a simple grave with a mud cross that's created across it, and then a group of individuals who are mourning, and then probably the widow of the deceased here. Your book says, immediately you kind of think about something like Courbet's burial at Ornans, but Courbet is very different. His is a very political statement because he's aggrandizing the peasants and demanding that they be recognized as a significant part of the French social fabric. Whereas Wernskjold, it's more of a documentation of, this has a mind of its own. It's in this. Whatever. It's a kind of a documentary approach, which is capturing for posterity a way of life that is traditional of Norway, but is also giving way in the wake of industrial progress. So natural versus real. Another example of nationalist representation from Finland. This is by Albert Edelfelt. It's called Old Women of Ruokolahti, and they're on the church hill. And again, you can see clearly they're wearing their traditional native costumes. And it's just a sort of slice of life of a group of people who are very devoted in their faith. They're going to church, as they have for hundreds of years. And then it's a chance for socializing afterwards. And so it's, again, a kind of a rural, traditional endeavor that people engaged in. Over in Sweden, there's an interesting movement, a kind of naturalist or naturist movement, which is chronicled in a way here or celebrated by Anders Zorn. To us, this doesn't seem like a big deal, but in the 19th century, the idea of representing in a very natural way nude figures was something quite shocking, because this is not a kind of a studio display nude, but these are nude women from Sweden who are skinny dipping, basically. And when you think of the Victorian morals that were so important in Europe at the time, this indicates the direction Sweden is going in the future, where there's a great sense of a kind of social liberalism, and that's still very much a component of Scandinavia today, where nudity is something that is considered completely natural and a part of just being human and in interacting with nature. And so we see that here. It's part of, too, a larger movement of reform. A movement starts shortly after this in the early 20th century, late 19th, called the Reform Dress Movement, where people come together, women and also the medical community, and they are very critical of the clothing that women are having to wear, like the whalebone corsets, which crush their internal organs and lead to all kinds of medical issues. And you begin to see by the early 20th century a revolution in fashion, much looser dresses, shorter dresses, things like that. In Germany, we've already seen Wilhelm Leibel, and his work is also intensely naturalistic. and in this case also nationalistic. This is called Women of Dachau. And Dachau has a kind of notorious fame since the World War II. It was a concentration camp. But at this time, in 1882, when this was painted, this was just a little town outside of Munich. And here we see women who are, again, in traditional dress and represented as praying in church. And so it's, again, something that brings them back to the simplicity of life, the simple purity of their faith, and a de-emphasis on materialism and consumerism, which is part of the industrial culture, and much more of a focus on the historical and traditional aspects of life in Germany.
You have really big hands. Is that normal? Kind of like a statement?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I'd have to research it, but it could be the idea that they are peasant women, you know, working with their hands, maybe. There's certainly a specific class of women, not from the aristocracy. A German painter named Max Liebermann painted this work called Amsterdam Orphan Girls. And again, it's sort of showing traditional costume and that sort of thing. But you still also see an awareness of the more modern movements that are going on, the way in which he pays tremendous attention to these pools of light, both on the ground and on the girls' dresses. It reminds us of what the Impressionists like Renoir, think of his At the Moulin de la Galette, the way in which he was exploring and capturing light there. And Liebermann is certainly aware of that and incorporates it into this work, even though it's a much more conservative and traditional work. Russian artists were also represented in the exhibition of 1889. Most of their works were very conservative, but some of them were more progressive. And one group in particular presented an anti-academic approach, and they called themselves the Wanderers because they were a Russian artistic society that would put their art on exhibition in traveling shows. And what they represented was real life, not history painting or romantic and sentimental scenes, but like the French realists, like somebody like Courbet, they wanted to present the hardships, the reality of life in Russia. And this is a work by Ilya Repin, and it's called Barge Haulers on the Volga. And you can see that it's what we call the Russian realist approach. It shows a group of 10 men who are literally operating like animals. They are physically pulling a barge that's in the water. And so it represents an extremely difficult physical labor that was done by the poorest of the poor. And in that way, it's sort of similar in intention to what Courbet presented, his realist work, showing the stonebreakers, forcing the viewer to acknowledge the existence of these people and sort of humanizing them. But Repin's is different because Courbet chooses to focus on the work as opposed to the individual personalities. We can't see their faces. But with Repin's work, we are drawn to their faces. He puts us at an interesting vantage point because we kind of look up at these figures and they are silhouetted against the sky. And each and every one of them has a different set of features and is responding differently to this demeaning and humiliating activity that they are forced to perform. So some of them are kind of defiant, like this guy. Some of them are just really beaten down. But they all have these different kind of human reactions to what they are going through. And this is painted just a few years after serfdom was outlawed, so almost slavery essentially was outlawed. And so Repin is making a statement by ennobling this kind of ragtag group by making their mundane tasks seem significant and drawing attention to it. Ilya Repin also painted works that had historical themes, and this one is, the title is Ivan the Terrible and His Son Ivan on November 15th, 1581. So it's a historical piece which depicts Russia's first Tsar, first emperor essentially, Ivan, after he murdered his son in a fit of rage. And the emphasis is on the remorse and the sadness that he feels. But it's also a political painting. It represents a key moment in Russian history. It was an act that led to centuries of political and social turbulence in Russia. And it alludes to something that happened in the contemporary world that Repin lived in the 19th century, where Tsar Alexander II was murdered by a revolutionary. And it's a sort of foreshadowing of the Russian Revolution and the discontent that was being felt in Russia at the time because of this huge gap in terms of the wealthy and the terribly poor. So Repin is kind of using this historical representation of Russia's first Tsar and this horrific act that led to disastrous consequences for hundreds of years, using that to highlight modern day tensions that are going on and this other Tsar who was murdered. And he does it in a really compelling way. I mean, the focus on the facial expressions of the figures. Well, the son is dead, but still covered in blood, and there's a sense of tension, and the father is just beside himself, distraught. And then we can see evidence of the struggle that has gone on with the weapon here, the furniture that's tossed over, and the idea of the kind of what violence can do in the space of a second. So all of these themes are nationalistic in various kinds of different contexts. Repin and the Wanderers are more political in their statements, and some artists have allusions to modernism in theirs, but basically the styles are naturalist and the themes are nationalist, and most of them are quite conservative. Well, the period from the last decade of the 19th century until World War I is often referred to as La Belle Époque, the beautiful epoch, which sounds like a lovely time to be living in. And for some it was. This is a poster by Alphonse Mucha, a Czech artist who was very famous for his poster designs, and in particular his depictions of this kind of glamorous age. It was a very decadent era for some, for the wealthy. It was a time of great enjoyment. There was tremendous patronage of the arts, music, and literature. Life was pleasurable. The rich, at this point, they didn't have any income tax to worry about. We see very wealthy industrialists coming into huge sums of money. And so it was a really terrific time for some. And your book chose this poster to embody this moment. It's a depiction by Mucha of the actress Sarah Bernhardt, who was sort of the poster child for this glamorous life. This is another one of Mucha's posters, and immediately you see Monaco, Monte Carlo, these glamorous spots that became famous in the 19th century along the French Riviera, that were frequented by the very wealthy, and they were places of great decadence and enjoyment. So that was kind of the beautiful epoch for some, but the last part of the 19th century for others, like Vincent van Gogh, was a time of distress and disillusionment. There were wide social divisions between rich and poor. There was political instability. And there were a lot of pressures that had been brought on by rapid social change and industrialization. And this is something that really kind of defines the 19th century in general, this sense of rapid change, which is totally destabilizing. And so this leads us to another term for the end of the century, which has a much more cynical tone to it, the fin de siècle. I think that has that accent on it. This was a period where there was a lot of weariness, despair, and anxiety, and this manifested in high rates of alcoholism, insanity, and suicide. And as we've seen, many artists were sensitive souls who suffered the effects. Van Gogh felt deeply for the poor, and he also suffered psychological problems and ultimately suicide. And it's also the beginning in this latter part of the 19th century of what becomes the definition of the artist in the 20th century. And that's sort of the artist as someone who exists separate from society, that they are kind of the lonely artist in the garret who is making sense of a world, a crazy world around them, and trying to present it on canvas or through sculpture or whatever. And it's no coincidence that psychiatry emerged as a growing scientific discipline with the likes of the French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot, and then of course the Viennese doctor Sigmund Freud. So the art of the period is really marked by these two manic phenomena, the luxurious excess of some and the anxiety and disillusionment of others. And you see that dichotomy